Hey there Dev Squad, Manuel here. In this tutorial I'm going to show you some basic concepts about 3D modeling so you can get started making your own asset. We're going to make the asset that you're seeing on screen right now, something very simple, just to get you started understanding those very basic concepts so you have a nice foundation for more advanced tutorials later on. This is a beginner course, but if you're already experienced with modeling, I suggest you stick around because there might be something that you can pick up. Alright, let's get started. Before we move on into our 3D program, there are some simple things that I want to show you. So in 2D world, we have these coordinates called X and Y. And I promise you, this isn't math. I know some of you see this and want to run away, but this is just something basic that you need to know for this. So this is coordinates for the 2D world. In the 3D world, we have three coordinates. So let's say X, Y, and Z. And these are sometimes interchangeable. They are not usually in this place. So for some engines, you'll see that Z is up, like 3D Studio Max, which is what I'm going to use. For others, you'll see that Y is up, like it should be. And this will all come into play later on when you are exporting your asset. We're going to talk about that later on in the tutorial, but I just want you to know that these are the coordinates that you'll be seeing whenever you're creating an asset in 3D. And these are some things that you need to take into account when you are exporting between programs, because sometimes you'll export, if you're working on a program that has the Z up, and you export it to some other program that has the Y up, then you'll see all of a sudden that your object is flipped and you'll freak out and you're just like, what happened? Well, that's the explanation. Some programs use this up, some programs use this one up. Now let's go into the basics of our 3D models. So our 3D models are composed of something that we call a mesh. So the reason why we call it a mesh is because if you look at the wireframe, it actually looks like this. So this is why I call a mesh. It's actually like a mesh in real life. So the mesh is composed by what's in the middle, which is the polygons, the edges, and the vertices, which are these dots that form every single polygon. When you're talking about assets for game engines, so real-time rendering engine, usually what it does, it calculates the amount of vertices. So what you need to take into account is the amount of vertices that you're going to have for your assets. That's why the triangle count is so important, or the vertex count if you want to do that, because this is what's going to tell you the amount of performance that you're going to get depending on what kind of hardware you have. That's why it's so important to know about the vertices and the polygons of your model. So when we are doing 3D art, we can get different types of polygons, and there are some types of polygons that are good, some others are bad, and some others are bad depending on the situation. So we have, these are the types of polygons that you're gonna find strictly on this tutorials and usually most around the internet. So if this has 4 vertices, so this is a quad. This one still has 4 vertices, but sometimes you'll see geometry that divides this one along into triangles or tris. You'll see me using this word a lot too. And then we have the other one, which is something like this. This is an n-gon. So we can call it by the amount of sides it has, but usually the term that you'll hear me using, and the term that's pretty much standardized when talking about this, is called n-gon. N-gon is anything, any polygon that has more than 4 sides. And this is sometimes, and I mean sometimes because it's not all the time, the bad guys. So you don't want to have n-gons in certain places, and I'm going to be explaining why later on when we're in the 3D program. But the ones that we'll mostly be using are quads and tris, just because these will be the ones giving us the best results there's a place for using these endguns. That being said, I usually try to avoid them unless I just need to make them and there's a specific situation for it. But just so you know, this is what we're going to be working with. Alright, so I'm going to take you now into the 3D program. Here we are in our 3D program. Now if you're working in 3D Studio Max, usually the first time you open 3ds Max, it'll be like this. I like to work in one single viewport, so I just click on the perspective one and press Alt W, and that would just zoom into the viewport that you've selected. The other thing that I like to do is take care of my unit measurements first, and this goes to anyone who's using any 3D program, because the assets that we want to make for game design will go into a game engine. A game engine has already pre-established units, unless you know how to mess with that, which that requires some programming, but the default's usually the metric system. So whichever 3D software that you're using, make sure that your units are on the metric system. So I'm going to show you how I do it here in 3D Studio Max. So on Customize Unit Setup, and here we are. As you can see, usually in 3ds Max it's generic units, so that means whatever units Max uses. I like to use real world, so sometimes I'll go in between US standard and metric depending on my project, but for game related assets I rather stick with the metric system. Especially here if you're in 3D Studio Max, make sure you go into System Unit Setup so you can change your units, because this is just for display. The actual units of the whole software are changed here. And the reason why I have it in centimeters is, unless I'm creating something that's really massive, I'll change it to meters. But if I'm doing characters, if I'm doing small props, I'll always keep it on centimeters, just because the number is much easier to handle. Another thing that's really important whenever you're making anything in 3D is to have reference. Even if you're making something as simple as this Victorian lamp, it's always good to have real world reference, just to know the scale and how is your object going to be look compared to any other asset in the world. And this goes to any style of art that you're adding into your game, even if your game is stylized. So in this case, what I did is just went to Google, type Victorian street lamp, and you'll get a bunch of images and examples, and there are various different ones. I just picked one that looks more like this, but you can pick whichever one you want, and then you just follow that. Now after you've picked your reference, it's important that you set up a scale. So for our lamp, it's going to be about 3 meters tall. So what I do whenever I'm setting up scale is I just grab a primitive. You can grab whatever primitive you want, but I like to grab a box. So I click on my primitive tab right here on the box. So I create a box on the floor. And now I can go into the Modify tab. If you're in 3D Studio Max, this is the Create tab that will show you all your primitives. And this is the Modify tab, which will show you the parameters of that primitive. So in here, I like to just go into height and type 300 centimeters, which is 3 meters pretty much. And this will give me the total height that I need. I'm not too concerned about the other values. I just want the height, because that's why I get my reference, just to know how thick my lamp is going to be. So this is the initial setup that I do whenever I start modeling. Always make sure that you have the correct units for the engine that you're working with. Make sure that you have your reference with you, and make sure that you have your scale. Now let's get started modeling. Okay, the first thing we need to drop in when we start modeling is our primitive. So in the same tab where we find this box, we can find the cylinder. I want to choose a cylinder just because the way this lamp is shaped. So I'm just going to click on the cylinder, and I'm going to draw it here as centered as I can, which again, it doesn't matter if you draw it somewhere else, you can always bring your item to the center, and I want to show you how later on. So I'm going to draw a cylinder here, and if you don't have these parameters, make sure you have them. So I want the cylinder, because we're making a low poly style of asset. It's going to be stylized. It's going to be suitable for throw-in games, and we're going to talk a little bit about why we do this props so low poly later on. But for now, I'm just going to keep this to an A-sided cylinder, as you can see here in the parameters. For my radius, let's round this up just to 22, and height actually doesn't matter. If you have more height segments over here, which usually Max does, if you're working with this program, just make sure you only have one segment. That way you don't have any extra polygons around here. We're going to create our own, but having those will be a little bit more of a hassle. So let's say you created your cylinder around here. You can always bring it to the center by using the coordinates. So the coordinates, if you're in 3D Studio Max, are down here. We have X, Y, and Z, just like we talked about before. And all I'm going to do is right click on these two arrows, which will zero out this value. Okay, once these three values are all the way down to 0, that means that our object is in the center of the universe, and so it's its pivot. This is very important whenever you are making assets for a game engine. It's very important to keep the pivot not only in the center of the universe, but also in the center of the asset. And in the case of this lamp, we want the pivot right here at 0, 0, 0. That way, when you bring it into your game engine, it'll be much easier to move it out in the environment. Now, in 3D Studio Max, we are going to convert this into an editable poly so we can start modeling it. So convert to editable polys right here. I just right click on the viewport, convert to editable poly. And one of the things I like to do is I like to eliminate the caps. So I'm going to eliminate those caps. And by the way, if you want to see an example of an n-gon inside the 3D program, this would be one of them. So as you can see, we have an octagon, pretty much 8 sides, but there's no connections over here. And this is what we call an n-gon because it's hard to just call them octagon, hexagon, pentagon, and all that. So we'll just go with n-gon anytime we have more than 4 sides. So I want to get rid of that cap, and I'm going to go into the front view. Right now we're on the perspective view, and this is easier for us to see the actual object. I like to go sometimes into what's called the orthographic views, which is this one right here. So this will be front, this will be the left side, this will be the bottom, and this will be the top. These are what we call the orthographic views, and the reason why it's called orthographic is because it's giving you a precise shot of the side that you're looking at. So here we are right at the top, and if I go back to the front, here we are right at the front with no perspective whatsoever, because if we are in perspective, then it's really hard to get that kind of a front shot. So, and by the way, in here in 3D Studio Max, there are plenty of shortcuts that you can use. So if you want to know what I'm using, I'll be using F for front and P for perspective. I'll be calling these out as I use them. So I'm going to press F for front. And right here on our editable poly, we have the selection tab. So these are the various parts of a mesh. Just as I explained in the beginning, we have vertices, edges, and polygons. Here in 3ds Max, we have a couple of extra things, which are element. This will allow us to just grab the whole object. Even if I'm just clicking on one polygon, it will grab the whole object. And border mode. Border mode only works if you have an open border, just like I have right here, and that's one of the reasons why I eliminated the caps, just so I can use the border. It'll be a lot easier for me to model that way. Okay, I'm going to go back to the front view, and one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to use the scale tool. So you're going to see in 3D programs that we have different gizmos. So this is the move gizmo, which shows arrows, kind of like showing the direction where your motion is going to go. Then we have scaling, and by the way, if you're in 3D Studio Max, I press W for the move tool or the move gizmo, R for the scale gizmo, and E for the rotation gizmo. Let's look at the scale gizmo. So this one's going to scale on whatever axis you want. I usually try to scale in the center if we're doing something on like this lamp, but you can always scale in the different axes if you want. Then there's rotation, which is this round thing here, and this circles only represent the axis that you're going to rotate in. So just to give you an example, and Control Z to undo, just like in every other program. Alright, so let's get started with modeling. I'm going to scale from the center because if I scale from here, I'm only going to scale in the X and Y. If I scale from the center, I'm scaling in all coordinates, so it's a uniform scale. So I'm just going to go like this a little bit. And I'm going to get another piece of geometry by holding Shift and dragging up. I'm just creating new geometry. Okay, maybe I'll lower it a little bit. And we can just scale it inwards like this. So this is a good way to show you why I'm using border mode, because if I wasn't, then anytime I will have to go and select the whole row. That way with border mode, I just click on one edge, automatically selects the whole row for me. Okay, so let's keep modeling. Gonna hold Shift, and this is how I'm creating new geometry. Bring this up. Okay, maybe bring up 1 and 2. And you're gonna see the second piece that we're going to do here. Okay, what you saw me doing this, creating this new geometry, that's just called extruding. Now we're going to do another form of extrusion by using the buttons over here. So this is the ribbon. If you're in 3ds Max and you don't have this, it probably looks like this. Just click on this arrow and it will show you ribbon. Usually it takes a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my whole ring, and if you want, just click on one polygon, hold Shift and click on the polygon next to it, and you're going to see that the program instantly tells you where it's going. So now we're going to click on extrude, and I like to do extrude settings. You can always just click on the button and do this, but I like to go into the settings just because this gives me a little bit more control and I can use numbers. So I'm going to go and change from group. Right now it's group and it's pulling everything towards that side. I change it to local normal. And this gets us into another discussion about what normals are. Normals are these polygons or faces. They have various different names, but the reason why I change it to normals is because now it's extruding each polygon in the direction of the normal. So as you can see, this normal is facing this way, it's going this way. This normal is facing this way, it's going this way, so on and so forth. Whereas if I had it on group, it's just pushing out in one direction. So that's why I changed it to local normal. Now, again, this is why I like doing this, because it allows me to use numbers as opposed to just guessing by eye. And I think lamp wise, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm going to put it down. So by the way, as you saw me doing right there, sometimes if you switch from an orthographic view into perspective, this may happen. So let's say I'm here and I'll switch to perspective, and sometimes this happens. In order for you to recover your object wherever it is, just press the letter Z and it'll bring your object to the frame. Okay, so just a little tip right there. So I'm gonna keep extruding, and I'm just following one of the reference that I showed you and kind of like stylizing it a little bit. So let's see how I want my main cylinder. So the main post of that lamp will be around this size. So just going to make sure that I take it all the way over there. And we're going to make this a little bit smaller. And I'm going to extrude another one And all I'm doing is just give it a little bit of variation to the silhouette of our model. Extrude another time. And we're going to extrude one more time. Let's see, all the way up to here where we said we're going to leave the post. And I'm just going to make this a lot smaller. Okay, and now we have the main shaft of our lamp. I'm just going to do one final extrusion over here, like this. And then we're going to go another extrusion like this one around here. So I'm just going to select, so click on one polygon, hold shift. I'll select the whole circle, and I'm going to extrude. All right. It looks like one of the things, and this is mostly for aesthetic purposes, I think this lowering piece is maybe too small, so I'm just going to bring it up a little bit. Okay. And now we have the main piece of our lamp. So one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to close this out over here, and you'll later on see why. But for that, I'm just going to hold shift and extrude some polygons. I'm going to use the X and Y coordinates, so that's why I select this row in the middle. I extrude this out, and I'm going to use one command that's right here. It's called collapse. And this will bring those edges into one point. We're going to do the same thing with the bottom. So X and Y. And I actually want to leave one and do a second one and collapse. Alright, and this will be the main cylinder of our lamp.
This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon. If you want more videos like this, check out my Patreon page using the link in the description. To stay up to date on new releases, make sure you follow us on social media.